The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Fransson. Tonight's episode is in memory of John Esposito.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. This show is a little different than any show we've done before. Some of the longtime guests or people who have been following the show recently know that I've had a couple of tough years. I lost my sister, my older sister, 2 years ago to cancer. A year ago, my younger sister was killed in an automobile accident with a drunk driver. And a couple of months ago, 2 years. Death, mourning, grief has been on my mind. Some of the guests I've had recently, we've gone into. Excited to interview. Been working on doing this in some time. The date was scheduled to air tonight, partly because this gentleman had, I believe this was the case from memory, he had a planned medical procedure that he mentioned was not going to be very challenging, and he wanted to schedule it after that. And sadly, he passed away recently on July 15th. His name was John Esposito. I was excited to interview John Esposito because he was at the center of Muslim-Christian understanding for decades. I have a good friend, Mikhail Abdus Salam, who has agreed to join me here tonight. We've had multiple discussions. He's been on the show a couple of times before. And through my relationship with him, I've grown in my understanding of Islam and those who follow the religion of Islam. And so I was very excited to have John Esposito on the show because he, as I mentioned, was a pioneer in this. He established the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in Georgetown way back in 1992 or 93. And he was an influential voice in the wake of 9/11 and a rising Islamophobia that entered into this nation and around the world. And he spoke for understanding and advocacy. He himself was a Catholic, but his appreciation for Islam and Muhammad was substantial. So we decided to go ahead and air some of the clips from the pre-interview that we did, which we used for our sneak peek, because there was substantial content that we felt could at least bring some of those core principles to light and give us the opportunity to have a discussion. As the guests, as the audience knows, I'm a former Christian minister who has a unique perspective today on this matter, and I'll be joined by my friend Mikhail Abdus Salam, who is a respected Muslim leader, an interfaith bridge builder, and the founder of the Interfaith Library. Let's welcome him to the studio. Hello there, Mikhail. I can't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute. I think you're on mute. You're still on mute. I can see the little mute button. While Mikhail is figuring that out, I will just tell you a little bit more about him. The Interfaith Library is...
There we go. Yeah. I have to learn how to use the iPad. How are you, my brother?
I'm doing great. You're joining us tonight from...
I'm actually here in North Carolina, one of my humble abodes. And yes, I am the founder of Interfaith Library Incorporated, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that disseminates religious information around the world, everything from Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Baha'ism, and many other religions. We started off as a repository of religious information, and later on within the last 10 years evolved into being a philanthropic organization that not only disseminates information, but we do community building, we do international works, and we also are proud to say that we're one of the organizations that represented the Americans and refugees coming back from Afghanistan in 2021 with the Allies, Operation Allies Refuge Program with the United States government and the city of Philadelphia. So, I mean, that's just a prelude.
Thank you so much. And in terms of this, the spirit of tonight's show, a memorial for somebody who recently passed away from complications related to heart surgery, which, you know, I don't know the exact procedure. We didn't go into detail, but it seemed like John felt like this was going to be something that was not extremely risky and not requiring a long recovery time. But you yourself have a depth of experience and understanding for that. Would you be willing to share a little bit about your own experience in that regard?
Absolutely. In around 2022, 2023, I was down in Honduras doing some, research and some studying and collecting of information to add to the library. I was very interested in non-traditional religions and ways of life and cultures, specifically in this case, the Mayan culture. I wanted to know more about it from the ground and more so reading things out of textbooks. But, the short, as I was down there and discovering this amazing, beautiful place, I started getting sick. And initially I thought it was the flu. And later on I said, okay, this may be pneumonia. This is a little more serious. Went to the doctors and found out that my heart was dying. They had just, as a diagnosis, they said I had cardiomyopathy, but we knew it was more than that because every day my ejection fraction was lowering. So for a year, I fought with my life. I was placed on an LVAD. If anyone doesn't know what that is, it's a left ventricle assist device where they literally put a pump on your heart and a computer pumps your heart for you. I was, in a dire situation, literally down to my last days and, by the mercy of God, when some people wrote me off and thought that it was over for me, a heart came. And March 21st of 2025, I had a heart transplant. March 21st of this year was my 1 year anniversary. I would say that I'm about 95% back to normal, through God's mercy. But through that experience, through that near death and, really frightening experience, I got to see the world from I know this sounds a little out of the world, but I see the world in two different perspectives now. I see things that other people don't see. I hear things that other people don't hear. And I don't necessarily mean that literally, but in the spiritual context. And so those things that used to be a complex thing are sort of really simplistic to me. And the importance of us coming together, like here today with you, Wade, is to truly bridging that gap of us far as human beings who believe in the one supreme being, no matter what we call him, that being who allowed us to be here. We have to get to a point where it's not the dogma or the theology itself that, we should be concentrating on more so than what is that divine wahi, that revelation that God gave all of humanity, and prior to us separating ourselves in groups, calling ourselves Christian, Muslims, Jews, Baha'i, or whatever. If I may say this, in the Quran, one of my favorite verses in the Quran, and many verses that always starts off with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is another name what we call for God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, all that's seen and unseen. One of the verse he says, Ya ayyuhalladina aminu, O you who believe. And when we look at this from the original language and the structure, we realize that he's calling believers and not people of religious denominations or sects. So, and we know this specifically because in the Quran he mentions the people of the book, the Ahl Kitab, Christians, or which we call the Nasara, and the Jewish people, what we call Yahudi. So the Sabians, those who follow the Proverbs and the Psalms, he mentions them specifically. But when he calls us collectively as a human race, human beings, whatever our culture is, whatever our religion is, whatever our faith is, our skin color or whatever, he always says, Ya ayyuhalladina aminu, O you who believe in me. And he describes who those believers are, those who are kind, those who fast, those who make prayer, those who worship him and are grateful. So I just wanted to preface that without being too long-winded, because I think that is a precursor to where this show might go today.
Well, thank you so much. I truly appreciate that. I also agree with you, from experience with near-death experiences, even just getting older and having people in my immediate family pass on that were unexpected. And I would say that a greater clarity begins to arise. So I can certainly imagine that having gone through something as substantial as you did with a near-death experience and a heart transplant, that there would be changes that would in fact open you up in different ways. I want to just share also a quote. This is from something called the Tablet of Ahmad. It starts out, he who is the king, the all-knowing, the all-wise. Lo, the nightingale of paradise singeth upon the twigs of the tree of eternity with holy and sweet melodies, proclaiming to the sincere ones the glad tidings of the nearness of God, calling the believers in the divine unity to the court of the presence of the generous one, informing the severed ones of the message which hath been revealed by God, the King, the glorious, the peerless, guiding the lovers to the seat of sanctity and to this resplendent beauty. So there's a call, it's an expanded version, if you will, of what you just said, calling out to the believers. And in the Bible, in the book of Hebrews, it says that he that would come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So that unity and that seeking of God certainly permeates thoughts of, passing on into the next life and what's really important. I want to now jump into the show tonight. So when we were considering whether or not we should go ahead with a show about John Esposito, what we should do, how we should do it, we went back and reviewed that pre-recording, and it was kind of amazing how, and it's not surprising. I don't necessarily want to say it's magical or mysterious. We were planning the show and what he wanted to talk about. And so those segments address that. There's, we only have about 12 minutes of video cut into 4 segments. We'll jump into them, show them, and then Makai and I will talk about them after we show each one. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight to do this in honor and in memoriam of the work of John Esposito. Here we go.
First of all, how long is a program usually?
It's an hour.
Okay, and
we're scheduled for. We're currently scheduled for Tuesday night, 8 p.m. on August 4th.
Okay.
And that's, if that's a problem, we can change it, but that's what we're currently scheduled for.
Okay. August
And,
4th.
and Sandra, the producer, will, lock that in and work out details with you. And you can reach out to me with anything as well in the meantime.
And how would I access past shows, or how is
they're all on YouTube. I can send you links.
just be useful, for me. This
Absolutely
sounds really interesting. It's it's
well, I'm very excited to have this discussion with you. We've had imams on the show, others that you might know of. We recently had I'm trying to remember her name, but her father was the founder of the Lubar Center for Abrahamic Studies at the Madison. I was surprised, she grew up blocks from where I lived here. What is her name? Dahlia Mogahed. I don't know if you know who she is.
I mean, the weekend with me.
Yeah. So she actually is the one that recommended I reach out to you, I think.
Yeah. She's coming up from Washington for the weekend. Yeah.
So there was the connection. That was actually the second time I spoke with John. The first time we had worked on that date, and he had shared that he had this medical procedure coming up. And I think that this interview was done back in like April. And the connection there was with Dahlia Mogahed. So the first question I have for you, Makai, is I know that when I first talked about you helping me with the show, you mentioned that you'd heard the name John Esposito, but you had to refresh yourself on who he was.
Right.
So first of all, what are your initial thoughts about him and his life and his work?
Well, I think he's an amazing guy from a perspective. I think, and maybe I'm speaking a little bit about you. Maybe eclectic isn't the word to use here, but I think that he's daring, he's bold. Again, you and I both know that maybe some people have adverse opinions about some of his positioning and statements if they know who he is. But I love that he's, he like you said, he's definitely studied and has built his position on what he understands and he's not afraid to touch, like yourself and I, not afraid to touch the difficult question. He sort of knows how to get around it in a way where it is palatable, using your words from the past. So I highly, highly respect him. I wish I could have spent some intimate time with him like I did with Karen Armstrong, another amazing person when we're talking about the world of theology. I'm quite sure you know who she is. A great.
I know quite well who Karen Armstrong is, because she didn't she write the Book of Cults?
Absolutely.
And so she did a feature on the church that I was in years ago, the Worldwide Church of God.
Okay.
And so I know Karen from that angle, which is a fascinating little coincidence here.
Yeah, so she's an amazing one. She was one of my early mentors. She was one of those people that had me looking at, Oxford University mainstay for like my theological understanding as a collective. And, and then, you can't knock or take away from her area of expertise. I mean, if National Geographic and PBS, they lock in on her for being an authoritative voice in theology as a whole. How can you dismiss that?
Well, let me share a couple of the events of John's life. He was born in Brooklyn, and I love coincidences. I love to highlight them. I don't mean to overemphasize them, and I certainly don't want to elevate myself. But it's funny because I'm dialing in from Brooklyn, not Brooklyn, New York, but Brooklyn, Wisconsin. So he was born in Brooklyn. I wasn't born there. My kids weren't born there, but I now live in Brooklyn. And he was born he was born on 19th of May, 1940. And he was recruited to Georgetown in 1993. And there he founded the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. This institution, it became an embodiment of Christian-Muslim dialogue. And in 2001 to 2002, he became one of the principal public interpreters of Islam in the wake of 9/11. And the book Unholy War was published at that time. And he was participating in the post 9/11 ecumenical responses. Um, his scholarship became intertwined with contemporary religious history at that point in time. There's a lot of focus on 9/11, what it did and didn't mean. Um, Before that, Islam was not in the public consciousness,
Exactly.
and for both good and bad. And then, as mentioned, he eventually died in the 15th of July following complications from heart surgery. Um, there's a couple of interesting symbolic layers because he was a Catholic scholar whose work, centered on Islam. He remained a practicing Catholic throughout his life, yet he consistently argued that Islam should be understood on its own terms rather than through inherited polemics. Georgetown notes that colleagues viewed his work as reflecting the Jesuit ideal of cura personalis, care for the whole person. His career occupied a unique position between these two religious traditions, intellectually grounded in Catholic higher education, academically devoted to Islamic civilization, and publicly committed to interreligious understanding. The institution he founded, the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, quite literally joined those identities.
Wow.
One detail I find historically striking is the juxtaposition of his funeral with the Islamic calendar, and I'll invite you to comment on this. While family and friends gathered for a Catholic funeral mass on the 25th of July, Muslims around the world were entering the first days of, I'll pronounce it incorrectly, Muharram,
Mahram, right.
Muharram, and approaching Ashura. So during this period, Catholics prayed the prayers of Christian burial. Muslims were entering one of the most reflected periods of their liturgical year. Scholars around the world were publishing tributes to a man whose life's work was helping those two communities better understand one another. This convergence is historically observable, regardless of whether one attributes symbolic significance to it. So, what are your thoughts on all that?
Well, you said two things that just struck me in awe, and you may or may not remember, or I may have not, said this to you before. I didn't know that about him, far as his religion. I knew he was a Catholic, but I also have a formal Jesuit Catholic background in education. And secondly, the month of Muharram, for those who don't know the Islamic calendar, is the Islamic New Year. And so the symbolism behind that moment, spiritually, I'm just sitting here swallowing while the transcendent during a period of a flip of a new year, ending one mission and beginning another, to me, it was a spiritual connotation. And to be a defender, if I can use that word, and I hope spiritually he appreciates me using it and not misrepresenting his life work. To be someone who tries to make lucid, sometimes a complicated understanding of Islam. He's well respected, and I appreciate him for it. But I think him and I kind of mirror in that regard, where I find myself championing, not necessarily like, but academically bringing Christianity and Judaism to the forefront mainly, and then getting to know you, allowing me to have a better understanding of the Baha'i faith, which is in and of itself a beautiful idea or concept, if I can say that without being disrespectful. The union of a divine word, like, when you look at the Baha'i, and those who may or may not know your faith, or the idea of there is this progression of revelation, and we have the consolidation of this whole line. And as you know, as a Muslim, this is how I defend Islam, that it is a line of revelation. And people used to debate it until I started substantiating it by our lineage of prophethood. When we start from Adam and we get all the way to Christ, people say, wait a minute, hold on. All of those are patriarchs in Islam? Absolutely. We might, use the Semitic language to call their names, like we don't
Well,
call
let's hold that thought now, because we're going to get into this in one of the clips that we're going to play here from John. So let's go to another clip from John, and we'll dive deeper into this thread that you're beginning to pull on here.
already say that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we go. Obviously, you have a rich and illustrious life focused on this, and we live at a moment in time where your life's work has incredible meaning and significance and impact. You mentioned you've got some upcoming speaking dates. Tell us a little bit about, and internationally, tell us a little bit about what kinds of questions you'll be asked to answer, and the nature of whatever presentations you're giving.
Yeah, well, basically, people will wind up asking me, how do I see where we are in the world today, in terms of what looks like the growth of authoritarianism, not only out there, but also here, and where do we go from here? I'll also be addressing issues like informing people about the extent to which interreligious understanding is undermined by the extraordinary growth and globalization of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, and how that affects religion, it affects our politics, etc. And I'll give examples. I will also deal with the creation of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and how that came about, and then what have we done. So in a sense, how it came about that Georgetown University developed a relationship with a group of Christian and Muslim businessmen who were concerned back when, in the early 1990s, that Islam would be seen as the next global threat. And then what we did as a center, and what we did responding to 9/11, in a context in which it was just common. And I'll probably give the example of my landing in Los Angeles 2 days after it to speak to a Muslim organization, and a car went by and had killed them all and let Allah decide. So I try to point out that that's not just a phenomenon back then, but it's a phenomenon that's occurring now. And usually what I do is, to some extent, with almost any audience, certainly in what I'm doing overseas, is to tell them who I am, in the sense that, yes, I'm somebody who deals with Islam globally and deals with relationship and interfaith, but also the political side. But that, in fact, that was never an intention of mine. That my grounding was clearly in Catholicism, that I was a Franciscan for a number of years. And then how and why I became significantly attracted by this religion that I couldn't understand back in the late 1960s and 70s, which was getting no attention. What was it about this religion, that really grabbed me, and about the people that I knew in that religion.
Wow.
So one of the things that jumps out at me there, we'll get into this a little bit more in the future clip. Well, a couple things. First of all, John had future speaking assignments. I didn't know his exact itinerary. Perhaps he did or didn't, complete any of those, or perhaps they were also scheduled for later. But he was going to be answering questions about the future, right? Not that anyone viewed him as a prophet, but his understanding of Christian-Muslim relations featured prominently in geopolitics. Now, my own personal understanding is that, and I'm coming at this from a biblical perspective, we can get your perspective on the Quran, but that 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy by one interpretation. By some other standards, more than 1/3 is prophetic. Those prophecies talk about what's coming. The book of Revelation, I'm doing a series right now in a Baha'i context talking about the book of Revelation to try to help Baha'is understand the words of one of the founders of the Baha'i faith, which is that every Baha'i must know and understand the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, the so-called Old Testament, and the New Testament as the Word of God. And he personally went through whole chapters in the book of Revelation specifically and went verse by verse and gave his exposition of what they mean. So I'm going through that to talk about how the book of Revelation predicts the future all the way from the time of Jesus forward to our day and age and beyond. And in that interpretation, there's a specific chapter, Revelation 12, which in my view is all about Islam. And of course, Muhammad came later, and he also was a prophet. He's in fact called the seal of the prophets. And there was additional prophetic information. But somehow in the Christian world, most people do not have this perspective at all and are completely ignorant of how and where Muhammad and Islam fits into prophetic interpretation.
Right.
And now John was going to be asked about his views on the future, not as a prophet, but as somebody who understands both of these. And he warns about the rise of totalitarianism, right? And if we read the pages of the book of Revelation, we see our world today described in fantastical terms by somebody who had visions 2,000 years ago of our modern day, which he couldn't possibly begin to grasp what a helicopter was or what the internet was or what cities like New York and London and telecommunications and global air travel, you know, from an age where they were still riding horses and donkeys for transportation with wagons and didn't have a combustible engine at all. So the things that John saw predicting forward, he was describing in fantastical terms, but now John was going to be speaking internationally about where we're at. And we know what has unfolded since April at the intersection of these religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So all of that is jumping out at me, you know, in terms of John's life and seeking understanding that could help resolve some of these pending crises and you know, stresses on the entirety of global civilization. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. I'd be interested in your take on what we just heard from John.
Well, like I said, and I, you know, this is one of the things that I respect about him because, like I said, even what you're articulating now, it's a very difficult conversation to have for people who sees life in a linear way and or you know, they're just, you know, tunnel vision. You know, it's my way, or, you know, our books say this or our books say that. But, you know, articulating or further expounding on what you said, what is, you use a word that, you know, when we're having debates, I always think that we should remove it from the debate because each one of us can have an interpretation of something that's written. You know, I'm one of those people who says, well, what does the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran actually say? And I take it from the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Arabic language. Because as you know, and you can have expounded in past sessions and different discourses, things are lost in translation. And once we translate something and into different languages, every time it's chopped up. And what people have to understand, and again, I'm not trying to be controversial, is the Bible that we read here in America and English speaking countries. You know, you may read something biblically and
it may say something in English and you're running with it. And therefore, you're saying because of what you were taught formally as a dogmatic principle or an ideology, and says, well, this is supported by what this says here, 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 and here. And then when I come back and I say, well, that's not what actually was originally wrote, that's an interpretation of what was actually said. And even in English, you can read a scripture and somebody say, well, I'll interpret it that way. And I think that's the problem we have when it comes to these sort of religious discussions, because everyone has their own perspective of what they understand from an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation from an original.
Well, and even when we have the original language, as we do with the Quran, language changes over time.
Absolutely.
And then there's the original historical and cultural context in which a thing was said. And the revelation that was received, to the degree that one believes in divine revelation, which I do, and I know you do, that concept that was conveyed by a word, especially when we're talking about the future and prophetic statements, the concepts that are needed to fully understand don't even exist.
Exactly.
The other thing is, there's a lot of symbolism in the Bible. I assume in the Quran, I'm a complete rank novice and rookie when it comes to the Quran, but I assume there is symbolic language.
Yes,
and this symbolic language often has both a physical and a spiritual interpretation.
Exo and esoteric.
And sometimes it has multiple. Sometimes it's a type. We might use the term fractal today, which didn't even exist back then, where this is a repeating pattern. I'll just use Elijah. Jesus said, Elijah must come, but he has come already. I mean, when he's referring to John the Baptist as the Elijah. But he says John the Baptist is Elijah, but he's also not that Elijah. Right. And then there's a real Elijah who was here, and Elijah that was here on Mount Carmel, he wasn't just a symbol, he was a real person.
A real person. Right.
So it gets complicated. So when I use the word interpretation, there are other more scholarly words, exegesis, hermeneutics, and so on. I'm going to throw a comment from the audience here in now. We don't always do this early, but he asks, are the original manuscripts of the Bible still in the British Museum? That statement, it's an intelligent statement in a way, but it also reveals a lack of full understanding. What do you mean the original manuscripts of the Bible, right? So the Dead Sea Scrolls were a monumental find by some standards. They were the most significant find in history of text, of theological material, but they are original manuscripts, but they are not the original manuscripts of the Bible. There's no such thing as, quote, the original manuscripts of the Bible. What is even the Bible? Which Bible are you talking about, right? The Catholic canon, and so on and so forth. It's an incredibly complex.
Right. And if I may add to that, like you said, and there was a couple of things, and I'm trying not to lose the track of thought you just had there. The one thing I want to articulate, if we all, regardless to our faith and our religion, if we all are in consensus, and I'm assuming we're all in consensus, that, Elohim, Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, Yahweh, Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever, however we define that divine being, I'm almost can concede to that most of us would agree that he's all-knowing, almighty, all-powerful. He can do whatever he wants. In fact, the Quran says all Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to do is say, kun fayakun, kun, be, and it comes into existence. Now, how it comes into existence is established by the laws that he created, meaning, in order for a child to come in, two seeds have to come together, and then the child has to evolve a certain way. This law cannot be broken for our existence. But with that saying, there shows a perfection in that. And in that perfection, we have to understand, if we acknowledge that God is perfect in every way, then what he has said originally has to hold firm to what he says today. The Quran says, La tabdila li kalimatullah. There is no change in God's speech because his speech is perfect. God already knows what's going to happen in the future. He's already known what happened in the past. So why there need to say, well, there's this new interpolation in scriptures, whether it's Bible or the Torah or whatever, why is there this new interpretation? Oh, well, we discovered something else. Well, what was the original script say? And now to add to that last part that you said, you was addressing the individual in the audience. We know in Islam, and this is one of the perfections we believe in Islam. Islam tells us who Christ is. He says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, that Isa, Jesus, Ibn Maryam, the son of Mary, was the Kalam, was the word, was the Spirit, was the Masihi. He was the Messiah. So the Quran is clear on these things, so we don't deviate that. Now the debate comes, what does the word Messiah mean? And all these people have these different interpretations. Instead of leaving what God said, everybody is of the consensus that the Messiah is anointed. Why do we have to even go ahead and expound and put our own human concoction on the level? And I just wanted to land the plane on this as well. When we talk about what was the original language or the original manuscripts, as the individual and the audience says, well, the Quran teaches us that Christ himself was the original manuscript. We call it the Injil. The Injil, when we say, well, we believe in all the holy books, we say we believe in the Torah. We believe in, which was the book given to Moses. We believe in the Zabur, which were the books or the revelation given to Dawood and Solomon, the Psalms and the Proverbs. And we believe in the Injil. The Injil was this holy book or the word given to Christ. That wasn't written down. And in fact, in Matthew's mentioned the gospel of Christ. But where's that gospel? It mentions it verbatim, the gospel of Christ, but where's that gospel? Just like in I think it's Chronicles, or there are several books that are mentioning other books that are in the Bible. When I go looking for those books, where are those books? And why did the authoritarian, not the authoritative, why did the authoritarians decide to remove these books that are even mentioned in the book? So I just want to say,
we're raising a whole lot of things now. I want to bring this back to focus. So gotcha. And thank you. I mean, we'll need to do another show together, and we will do another show together. We need to get back to what John was saying. But my professional experience in the last 15 years, and even going back decades ago when I was doing work behind the Iron Curtain, was as a negotiator, right? We negotiated with government tourist agencies behind the Iron Curtain to bring in groups of believers and worshipers who were essentially, contrary to law, worshiping God behind the Iron Curtain. There was negotiation involved. The traditional picture of this is, drinking the vodka and tossing the glasses into the fireplace once you reach agreement, right? And the basis of that agreement was they wanted the valuta, they wanted the Western currency. So they compromised, and we wanted to expand, our teaching and our worship into lands that were forbidding it at that time. So there was an essential agreement. We agreed on the essential value proposition. More recently, I've spent now a decade and a half in very complicated, high dollar value technology negotiations where there are many stakeholders around it. There's the business that wants to accomplish something. There's finance that doesn't want to spend any money. There's the supplier who wants to get a lot of money. There's the legal department who wants to put all the risk on the other side, and so on. And there are more there's data security who needs to protect. There's AI committees that want to protect. So you have to then reach, what is the basis of agreement? What is the foundational basis of agreement? So this is, I think, what John's life was about. The agreement here is a willingness to understand, not to necessarily agree on everything, not to prove who was right and who's wrong, whose version of understanding is right or wrong, or insist, on any basis that this book should be in or out, that this word means this or that this is more or less authoritative. But the agreement on how to reach unity. What is the lowest common denominator here, right? Well, we are all created in the image of God, which is the purpose of the title of this show. We are all created in the image of God. That's kind of the basis. There are other people who have joined the show who don't believe that, and I can have a discussion with them. But my premise is clear. This is where I'm coming from. This is the lowest common denominator. And if somebody else interprets that, well, we're not created by God, but we are one. We are one people, and we need to have a common basis of understanding. So it's getting to that base level of understanding, and even having the discussion. So I want to we'll get into some specifics, and we'll predict, not prophesy, but we'll predict that you and I will come together and dig into some of these topics in more detail when we have more time. But I want to play the next segment from John's show, or from John's interview, which gets into a really thorny topic here. Another question that will help to orient us in terms of the show. Tell us a little bit about the charter and the goals of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding.
Well, the center was created by these businessmen in light of the Iraq War and then Afghanistan, and the concern that Islam would be seen as the next global threat. Now, the way that we addressed that was first of all to create a program at Georgetown in which, in the School of Foreign Service, so we're dealing with students with that kind of mentality, within the School of Foreign Service, and dealing with both with the religious dimension, but also the political dimension of faiths. So you just don't offer a course on Islam or Christianity. You deal with Islam and Christianity as they in their origins, but also in their interaction, and you deal with and try to communicate if you will, what these religious traditions were like. I.e., yes, there was the Crusades, and you do have a history of confrontation, but that also, in fact, if you take the religious traditions themselves, that there is a clear basis for interfaith understanding, and that's important. Because we also give examples when we teach about the fact that, for example, our diplomats did not, in their being trained, never dealt with religion in the societies that they dealt with. And the point is that if you're a Westerner, sometimes, although that's changed now more recently, you see religion as sort of a personal thing and separate from politics, and not realizing that in many societies, the religion, whether it's in Buddhism or whatever, it's part and parcel.
But even especially Islam, because you have 50 Muslim majority countries, of which about 25 are considered Islamic states, i.e. they have Islamic law integrated into their national. So they are, America is a nation where we have freedom of religion, and some even take it to want to have a nation where we have freedom from religion. Yeah. Whereas in the Muslim world, it's all so we lean this way, they lean that way, from a kind of center. And I understand and respect that, to be honest, from my background. So here we see John, emphasizing this basis of understanding. The Christian Muslim Center of Understanding was designated so that we could understand Islam and not view it as a threat, not have that fight-flight reaction. In the interest of time, I don't want to comment on that segment. I want to go right to the next segment, because that next segment gets back to the roots in Scripture of the contention. And I think this is going to tee up future conversations that we can have that dive into some of those topics that you bring up about, which books are or aren't included in this or that version of the Bible, and what the words are and actually mean in the original languages and all that. So we'll play this last clip and then we'll get into that. One more question, and this is related more to what we may or may not want to get into in the show.
Yeah.
It's my understanding, again, as a Baha'i, first of all, that Muhammad is a legitimate prophet of God, everything that Islam believes he was. With some minor exceptions or clarifications, the Baha'i faith doesn't believe that the phrase from the Quran that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, doesn't believe that it means what Islam interprets it to mean. It is authentic, it is true, but its interpretation might vary. Your mileage may vary on what exactly it means. However, the Baha'i faith would come down on the side of the interpretation that the Bible actually is misinterpreted on the subject of who the child of promise was. Ishmael was the firstborn son of Abraham.
Yeah.
And then you have all this dispute about birthrights and Jacob, the heel catcher, who stole the birthright and the blessing, from Esau. This goes way back, and it has not been resolved. You talked about it's strange that these things haven't. Well, guess what? They haven't been resolved. Even the Cain and Abel thing. It's my personal interpretation that the prodigal son is Jesus's flipping of the script of the Cain and Abel story, because in the prodigal son, aside from who the father is, that's maybe the most important thing and how the father behaves. But then the children, in terms of understanding the father, and Jesus came to reveal the father, we see this father embracing the wayward son, the son who had displeased him in that sense. And who is the bad son? Who is the jealous son? Well, it's the good son becomes the jealous son. The Cain and Abel story is about sibling rivalry and jealousy. And Jesus flips the script on that story in the prodigal son, even the Cain and Abel story. How fundamental and foundational is that? And if we see Jesus, in my opinion, flipping the script on that story, talk about new wine in old wineskins. So I don't know how much of this, if any, we want to get into on the show. What's your take on some of this foundational dispute between these peoples based on their religious beliefs and interpretations?
Well, I think that what one needs to do is to realize that that often the way people have been educated is if you're Jewish, you've got the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, full stop.
Right.
If you're Christian, you've got the Old Testament, New Testament, but full stop. What they need to realize also is that if you are a Muslim, you need to extend it one more time. And there was a scholar that wrote a book. I wrote the introduction for it, and it was the first one. I think the title was like "Children of Abraham." But what was interesting, it would be like you'd want to have sitting, if I were giving a talk or something, or just a Jew and a Christian, and then say, no. If we say children of Abraham, guess what? You, the Jew, need to recognize, the Christian dimension. The Christian, you need to recognize not only, the past, but the future. How do you deal with the example I often give is to say, do you realize that Muhammad and Islam recognize the great prophets, recognize Jesus, and that in the Quran, there's an entire chapter on Mary. Mary has almost an insignificant role in the New Testament compared to, and I think that it's such a basic thing, but I think it's been obscured so much by the almost like the ego of the religious traditions, like I've got the right answer, and if I do, then the other doesn't exist. And I think the challenge today is really, if one really saw the children of Abraham, then you wouldn't have, first of all, you wouldn't have anti-Semitism, but you also wouldn't have Islamophobia.
Right. So it sounds like you are willing to get into that level of awesome. Well, we're out of time, but we have everything we need. Any questions for me? Before you answer, let me just quickly reiterate the flow of the show is the first segment is your backstory, your creation story, your upbringing, your childhood, your parents. Then, sort of an arc, which you sort of decide it's an organic live discussion. You'll then, talk about maybe that epiphany of being curious and then going to study Islam, or however you want to sort of end that conclude that initial statement or segment. Then we'll go to the video break, which is a video you'll provide or we'll create for you. Has the discussion been had about that at all with Sandra, the producer?
No.
Okay, she'll initiate that so that we get a 60 to 90 second video that you can provide or we'll create. And then the second segment is, your life's work, the establishment of that center, what you've been doing. And then the final segment is where are you growing next, which might get into those upcoming talks and the current and future state of the world, right? So, and it's a very organic, live, friendly discussion where we present your views to the audience.
So we discussed including that very last part, but we thought we would give the audience a little bit of insight into how the show is made and the loose scripting of the show, and also sort of conclude the interview with the sadness that we didn't actually get to hear John tell his story about the forces that shaped him as he led up to this, and go into detail about where he was growing next. He did talk about those speeches, or those presentations, and how he would be asked to talk about the future. We talked about that a few minutes ago. But I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to have met John and had that time with him, and to be planning this show and to now be in memory of him. I want to also highlight that he was open to getting into these topics that Makai and I are predicting, not prophesying, but predicting that we will get into in the future about Ishmael being the firstborn son of Abraham. And interestingly, the thing that he left me with was this phrase, the ego of religion, right? In Buddhism, there's this concept of getting rid of the ego. And the joke is, in a Buddhist retreat is all fun and games until somebody loses an eye. And I is obviously spelled with the single capital letter I, not E-Y-E, right? It's all fun and games until somebody loses an eye, right? But that's the essence of Jesus' statement, esteeming others better than oneself. And he that would be great among you must become the servant. And even Paul's statement about husband being the head of the wife, yes, in the way that Jesus was the head of the church, who gave himself for it. And when Jesus, knelt down, he washed the feet of the disciples, and Peter's reaction is, never will you wash my feet. And then Jesus said, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part in me. And then Peter's reaction was, well, then wash all of me, right? So Peter, struggling with his ego when confronted in that sense with something from the next world, from the other world, something born of the Holy Spirit, right? As was mentioned, Mary with child of the Holy Spirit. So much there to unpack between these discussions, and in future episodes, Makai and I will geek out in those Bible verses to unpack what's there, what can be known, what can be understood, so that people can form their own interpretation of, in my view, an incredibly important verse, Isaiah 11, the lion will lay down with the lamb. Those are symbolic of the beasts of the field, which are sometimes symbolic of nations. But to me, this is my interpretation. I get it from nowhere. It's not authoritative. But obviously the lamb could be referring to Christianity, Jesus being the lamb. The lion could be referring to Judaism, the Lion of Judah from Genesis 49. So in Jerusalem, you also have whatever Islam is identified with. I don't know what creature or beast it might be identified with, but you have the Dome of the Rock, you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you have the of course, Jerusalem, the city. You have the Church of the Nativity. In Israel, in that Holy Land, you have these different religious edifices, all sort of competing for a territory to share the territory. And there's a lot of tension there. And the lion, in that sense, hasn't laid down fully with the lamb yet, but it's prophesied to come, and greater understanding might bring it on. And we will get into some of the nuance, some of the detail as we meet again to go into the thing that John said, yeah, sure, we can have that discussion. We'll continue to do that in honor of his legacy. Those are my thoughts. Makai, I'm going to give you the last word to share your thoughts here on tonight's show and what you would like to leave with the audience before we then go to the sneak peek of next week.
I appreciate you, and again, thank you for always welcoming me to your show. We don't communicate as often, but you are a dear friend of mine. I speak about you so highly. I probably have some people in the comment section who are finally glad to put their eye on you. I speak highly of you, tell them how often when we want to. And then I still am so sorry that we didn't get to do that little summer thing you just passed up at the lake. I would have loved to have been there with you and your family. But in the same thing, the same context, I think, Mr. Esposito is an amazing man. It's how, it's that 6 degrees of separation, our creator, the Most High, God, Allah, however we want to address him, how he keeps his champions tied together. Who in the world would ever think that, Wade Fransson would elevate to where he's at with his theological understanding, Makai Abdussalam, with his journey. I have a family member in the audience, if she's watching, with her journey and this transcendence, and to see here is another man who we all know, if you're a Catholic, diehard, at the age, and here is another man whose eyes open with the endless possibilities of what we call the divine wahi. The revelation can't stop here because this is incomplete. So, and again, I'm just going to always, just remind us, and the analogy, if I can use an analogy, no matter what our faith is, no matter what our belief system are, what I mean? Let's just try to view this as a mountain going to a peak. And there are many paths on this mountain, and we can all sit up there and say, oh, I'm on the right path, or I'm on the right path, or I'm on the right path. But no matter what path you're on, if it's a path heading towards the Almighty, the Most High, when we get to that summit, when we get to the peak and we all see each other, the only question we're going to ask when we get up there is, where did y'all come from? Welcome home, and that's just how we should use that. And I want to close with that Quranic verse, or those verses. Ya ayyuhalladhina aminu, O you who believe. Ya ayyuhalladhina aminu, O you who believe. So if we come together on that, and one other, and I want to close on this, there's a verse and loosely translated in the Quran. It says, when we differ, we find things that we differ on, just come together on those things that we agree on. And then somehow we'll work those differences out. So I want to close and thank you, Wade, again, for always making me feel welcome and special on your app. When you pull me up, I feel like, okay, somebody's recognizing my hard work. So I appreciate you for that. Thank you.
Well, I do greatly appreciate what you've done with the Interfaith Library, and what I've been, grateful to have learned from you, and will continue to learn. I guess I'll just simply invoke the title of the show, Created in the Image of God, and the tagline, Building Vibrant Communities. And what I'll say about that is, I come from a faith tradition. I spent decades was in the ministry in, We had fervent love for one another. We did so much together. We would come together each year at the Jewish festival of Sukkot, which we celebrated with a Christian understanding. So we were already bridging the gap between Judaism and Christianity in a unique way, for better or worse, with whatever understanding we had, but we were fervent about it, and our love for one another was fervent. Our community was vibrant, powerful, zealous, but it was isolated. It was small. And what was always missing was the ability to reach out and welcome others in without the need, in a sense, invoking now the New Testament, force them to be circumcised, which is a very painful personal experience if you're an adult male and you would need to be circumcised to join a community. This was the debate in the early Christian church, right, between Peter and Paul. And you talked about differences where we differed. Those men differed, right? And Paul even says, I withstood him to his face, right? So there's some tension and contention around what? Around what is required for somebody else to join in close fellowship. And here we are mirroring that despite those differences, we can have a close, loving, brotherly fellowship. And that building vibrant communities is a large community and a diverse community, a community of communities, even. I'll give you the last word again because I overspoke, but I'll let you respond to that, and then we'll go to the sneak peek.
Well, I just want to say, since you talked about, in the end, created an image God in your motto at Interfaith Library, we say, in the view of God, we are all one, brothers and sisters. We are brothers and sisters. We all are. And when we look at it fundamentally, genetically, esoterically, exoterically, we all come from a single source. And I want to leave you with that.
Amen.
Amen.
Here's the sneak peek. We will see you all next week. And thank you, John Esposito, for your life's work and for the opportunity for us to do this show together.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, August 9th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time, host Wade Fransson interviews Graham Tomlin, theologian, author, and editor-in-chief of Seen and Unseen. He reflects on the church's role in today's culture and how Christians can engage the world with wisdom, imagination, and hope. From theology and public witness to living out the gospel with clarity, compassion, and conviction. And then on Tuesday, August 11th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Fransson interviews Derek Vreeland, pastor, author, and discipleship leader. He explores what it means to keep Jesus at the center and how his way transforms our communities, relationships, and everyday lives. From spiritual formation and peacemaking to following Jesus with greater kindness, faithfulness, and purpose. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in the Image of God.